Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Brief. I'm your host, Meredith Reed. I'm here today with Emily McDonnell, Head of Trust and Safety at Remind. Remind is a communication platform that helps educators reach students and parents where they already are on their phones. Remind's app allows educators, parents, and students to send and receive text and voice messages, as well as share attachments and links to digital educational resources. The company was founded in 2011 with a straightforward value proposition to provide teachers with a safe and secure way to send homework or study reminders to students and their parents on mobile devices without using personal phone numbers. The Bay Area native former preschool teacher and mother to a 1-year-old joined Remind's support team in 2014, going on to become their head of support and then moving into her current position as their head of trust and safety. Welcome, Emily.
Welcome. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I'm going to start with a very straightforward question. Can you give us a brief overview of Remind? What is it and who is it for?
Absolutely. So you mentioned it a little bit in the intro. We are a communication platform for educators to reach every student and every parent. We are currently used by over 60% of teachers in the US. We're used in over 80% of public schools and in over 90% of Title I schools. And Title I schools are schools that have a high concentration of low-income students, and they receive supplemental federal funding to help those students meet their educational goals. And like you were mentioning, it is one of our main security and safety sort of value propositions is that nobody's personal information is ever shared. So email addresses, phone numbers are kept private between the class owners and the participants in their classes.
Those numbers are truly amazing, especially as someone who personally has been out of the school system for so many years now. I was really blown away. I mean, when I was in middle school, high school, we just didn't have technology on this level. So that's really fascinating. I also saw an article that in 2018, Remind took the #1 spot on iTunes for free iOS apps, even ahead of apps like Gmail, Instagram, and YouTube.
Yeah, and we've hit #1 in the Android App Store as well. And what's exciting about that is that it's rarely an education app that's hitting #1. And so we've seen that in the years since then as well. So that's just been really exciting and validating, honestly. It's been fun to watch those charts.
So, Remind has a major focus on one of the principles that we talk about frequently on the brief and at Spectrum Labs, safety by design. Can you talk more about how safety by design was integrated into the Remind platform?
Absolutely. So the crux of safety by design is recognizing that we have students on our platform and their well-being and their data requires an extra level of responsibility to protect. So when we say safety by design, we mean making sure we are keeping at the forefront of our mind who we are designing for, which in many cases is kids and the school systems that support them. So when we are designing a feature or even thinking about what features to offer, we need to be providing value that is appropriate for the school context. We take into account the controls that we are providing to teachers and to administrators, and we make sure that the features are going to be supporting student learning, and we keep safety as part of the conversation throughout the design, the launch process, the user research, user testing process. We're making sure that we're reaching out to the stakeholders necessary and providing the tools like being able to pull message history, for example, that are necessary to make sure that our platform is as safe as it can be.
So, I'd also like to talk about another aspect of keeping this platform secure, which is keeping student data safe and secure from the outside. So, can you speak more about some of the potential risks and threats to a platform like Remind that houses a lot of student data?
Absolutely. So the tricky part about student data is that because these are kids who may be joining or beginning to use online tools for the first time, this data is often very clean data. So it isn't like my old previous Gmail email that has probably been compromised before. Like, this is a special class of data that we need to take extremely seriously and protect to the best of our ability. So to that end, we have a formal security program. We have a senior leadership committee. We have a bug bounty program that's really active. We have over 200 researchers worldwide, constantly looking for ways that we can be improving. We have security advisors on retainer, and we just spend a lot of time every single week focusing on how we can continue to be best in class from a privacy and security standpoint.
So, to what extent do you monitor conversations on your platform? Are students able to communicate directly with each other, or do you allow for any non school related conversation? I just have so many questions about what type of safety measures you take internally with regards to monitoring the conversations on your platform.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we leave a lot of the permissions up to the class owners, so teachers and administrators. So it's at the classroom level that a teacher is deciding if everybody can see and message everybody, if you can only message the people with the same role, so students can message students, parents can message students, or if you can only reply to the class owner, or if they can't even reply to you as the teacher. So it's up to the teacher. And we give school and district administrators the ability to set their defaults for their entire school. So they can say, they can set the standards and the guidelines for how those settings should be. The tricky part about Remind is we are not a self-contained ecosystem. So if we were a gaming platform, for example, everybody would be there for the game that we are offering, and any conversations that happen there are because of the content that is on the platform. We're a little different from that. So the reason that kids are going to be in these groups is because they are enrolled in the real world in this class, and there are, real world class dynamics that are at play in any of the conversations that can be happening. So our approach is, of course, giving users the ability to report any other users that they see, and we'll review those reports. But the best way that we can help is empowering our administrators to be able to access message history, for example. And we will work with them closely because we don't know what the dynamic is between the two students in the conversation. If the teacher is, given those permissions, we don't know what the home environment is like for these students. So we can't always take the traditional approaches of identifying bad actors and then kicking them off our platform. Because if a kid is having a tough time and is struggling, it isn't necessarily the right thing for us to do to say, well, now you don't get your math homework assignments. Like, that's not going to change. That's not going to help the kid. So there's a lot of nuances that go into supporting our kids in their communities. And I would say partnering closely with administrators is one of the ways that we can do our best to support these students.
So ultimately, whose responsibility is it to flag potentially high risk conversations or behavior? Does that fall on the school administrator, or is that seen as the responsibility of Remind?
Yeah, so it's a mix, right? It's not on the administrators necessarily to flag the content of the conversations. We give them the ability to go investigate any sensitive situations that they may know about from their actual school context. Like, if they know that these two kids are having a problem, they can go investigate that. So we give them the tools to look into largely situations that are already known. Like I was mentioning, we do rely on our users to report it because they often know best if it is not constructive. And then we have some tools in place on our end, like scanning images, for example, that can alert us to situations that need further review.
Are any of your moderation operations automated? And do you see that automation is an effective way to take extra safety measures for the users on your platform?
Yeah, so it is. We err on the side of having too many false positives, to be honest, because we have kids on our platform. So we need to be as careful as possible. So I'll just give you an example that stuck with me. One of the images that was caught looked like a pretty unsafe situation that we acted on very quickly. And it turned out that it was for like an AP Gov class, and they were staging evidence for this mock trial that they were going to be carrying out. So I would say that more gets flagged than is probably necessary. But we find that to be the approach that is appropriate for our community. Like, we have to err on the side of caution when you have students involved at all. It's not always just adults. We've got to be making the best decisions we can for these kids.
So I'm interested in talking a little bit more about how parents use your platform and where they come into the whole ecosystem and what their capabilities are as far as viewing their child's messages or messages within the classroom. How does that work?
Yeah, so this is another thing that we largely leave up to the teachers in terms of how parents are involved. And just a short answer for what they can view, parents link their accounts to their students. So if a parent is linked to a student, they have rights to that account. So that's the short answer there. In terms of how they're involved, we see a lot of variance. First of all, at the grade level. So if it's an elementary school teacher, it's largely parents, right? Middle school kids are mostly having their own phones and being able to engage more online. High school, we actually often see teachers trying to get parents out of the way so they can start working directly with the kids and help them become responsible for their own learning, so that when they go off to college and they don't have as much parental involvement as they had in high school, they're better prepared. So the way that parents are involved depends. Either a teacher will have them in their class, or they'll set up a separate class for parents, so they're not getting all the nitty gritty day to day, but they can reach parents when they need to communicate about a field trip. And then it's up to teachers as well to decide if they want a group chat to be between the parent and the student, or if they want to set up, there's like a team working on a project together and it's all the students collaborating, that the teacher sets up a chat for them and the students. It's really up to teachers in terms of how parents are involved in using Remind.
And are you able to view the lesson plans and the materials that teachers are sending to their students? Is that something that you also are able to flag if necessary, or is that strictly in the domain of the teachers and the administration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't have much oversight into what they are sending, partly because we have so many integrations. So we are enabling teachers to send whatever their learning content is right from our composer. And that means that they're connecting to their Google Classroom or to their Google Drive, to their Quizlet decks. And that content is housed in those other services, and they're just sending out the links to that content. We aren't so much a content creation service. We don't yet have like document creation, for example. We're really the communication channels by which they're sending out the resources that they may have made on Flipgrid or any other of our integration partners.
So I'm curious if you've ever run into an issue just because you have so many users. I would
Mhm.
imagine you've seen a little bit of everything. How would you handle an issue where you have, whether it's a teacher or a student or a parent, who is repeatedly violating the terms of your service, when you can't necessarily kick them off because it's an integral part of them either being enrolled in school or
Mhm.
enroll part of their employment? How do you handle something
Yeah.
like that?
Yeah. So we do have a bunch of tools on our end. We can mute users. We can ban them from creating classes. We can ban them from a particular class, from a particular organization. So think about parents and custody issues, for example. Like we may need to say, based on what we learned by speaking with administrators, which is always our first go-to because we don't have the context. We don't understand the family dynamics. So we will check in with administrators about what the appropriate way to have our product set up, such that it's reflecting their intended, the way that they're running their school. So we may need to ban people from joining, not necessarily every class on Remind, but you really can't have access to this school. And we can block people from sign up, but the way that we are determining the right path is we can be heavy-handed. So we have certainly muted students and had teachers write in on their behalf saying like they have to be able to ask me their questions, and we have a conversation with them. It's like, okay, well, go talk to the student about what the status of their account is, and if you tell us that you need them to be able to message their classmates to not fall behind in school because that's not fundamentally going to help the kid, we can revisit that. So we have the tools in place. It's just trying to always get to the bottom by working with teachers and administrators to figure out what are the right permissions for this kid in this context, which is so hard for us to make that decision in a vacuum without knowing what that context is.
I can imagine that would be incredibly difficult, especially as an outside third party
Yeah,
that's just trying to help everyone get the information they need, but also keeping people following your terms of service. So,
exactly.
another question for you about safety and security. What is your process for verifying the identity of the users on your platform?
Yeah. So when you sign up, it's email or phone number based. It's not username. Like you have to be able to receive a text or an email at the email or the phone number that you put in. And at the end of the day, we don't know whose fingers are on the keyboard, but we do know that they have access to the phone that receives those texts or to the email account that they've used to sign up. We make sure that the accounts are valid in that way.
Do they have a school email address that they're supposed to use? Again, it's been so long since I was in
Hmm.
school. We didn't have school email addresses at that point. So I'm just curious how that
Yeah,
works.
yeah, it depends. So not all schools issue school email addresses to students. Most of them do now. Not necessarily, again, at the elementary school level, but we have fewer elementary school students than we do kids of older ages. And it really depends how the account is being created. So we could have a district purchase Remind for their entire district, and they go through a process that we call rostering, which means that all of the accounts are automatically provisioned with the school email addresses. So that's sort of one extreme, all the way to a classroom teacher could say, we're going on a field trip. We have to be able to stay in touch, and they'll share out their class code and they'll tell other students to take out their phones and text in this code to our short code. And it's a teacher and it's text based because people, 98% of texts are read. People aren't checking their email as much. And so it totally depends on how it's being implemented and rolled out in that situation.
So, what happens to data once a student graduates or leaves the school or a teacher and is no longer an active user on the platform? Can past conversations still be accessed by teachers in the years ahead, or is that no longer accessible?
Yeah, so there's a difference between who you are still able to message and what message history is available to you. So you as a user, we say if you were involved in a conversation, you have a right to that record of the conversation, and that's to protect you as well. If the other person said something, you need to be able to say like, here is what I said and she said in the conversation. So you have a right to that history. But if you are no longer connected by an active class, there's no reason for you to continue being able to message the other person. So the chat permissions are separate from being able to see that record. And then in terms of what happens when students graduate, we hope that they go on to use Remind at their new school. So the account is tied to a person, not necessarily to an organization. So I might log into my Remind account and I have my kids' soccer team and I have my book club and I have my other kids' band teacher. So it's kind of in all different areas of your life that you might be using Remind. The one thing I would say is we treat the data of students who are under 13 much more carefully. And so if that account is inactive for a certain period of time, we will actually just delete the account because that's the data that we really want to be getting hard deleted as quickly as possible. Everybody else, because we expect them to continue using Remind through their educational career, we don't want them to necessarily lose all of their history and content, but we are much stricter with the counts of students under 13.
So have you seen that there are many school districts that aren't able to use something like Remind because a large number of their students don't have cell phones or don't have home computers? And what do you think about possible ways to fix that system going forward?
Absolutely. So one of the best things about Remind is that it is easier to reach families when you have so many different ways of getting in touch. So one of the great things about Remind, it does not require a computer at home. It does not require internet access. All it requires is someone in the family to be able to receive texts, which by and large is how families do have access to text. And if nobody has a phone number, then, back when we could go to libraries, they could go to a library. But otherwise, if they are completely off the grid, then we're back to sending notes home in the backpack, which is one of the problems that we're trying to solve for, because the notes don't usually make it home. And if they do, they might make it to mom's house, but not to dad. So that's one of the problems that we feel we are uniquely positioned to solve, is connecting families who don't have internet or don't have devices other than just a flip phone that can receive text.
Well, I think this would be really helpful too with the whole "I didn't get the note" thing.
Exactly.
If the note gets lost and you never really know who's to blame,
Yeah.
or who's responsible. So yeah, I could see that being a really useful system of communication. So I do want to talk about how your platform has been impacted during COVID-19, because obviously this is the remote learning that's taken place is huge. But I do have two quick questions for you before we touch on that. So this, on the platform, it says it's K-12. Are there any colleges, universities, or businesses using your platform as well?
Yes, so we should probably update that pretty soon, because we certainly have universities who are using Remind either by upgrading to a Remind plan or using the free version. And that is an area that we are actively expanding into. And then businesses, it is fine to use Remind if you are a business, but it cannot be for commercial purposes. It cannot be revenue generating in any way. So if you are a pizza shop and you want to use Remind to coordinate staffing and say like, Susie is sick, can anybody make the shift? Or, don't forget that we have our monthly staff meeting, like please, if you're not working, be sure to stop by. Like those kinds of logistical coordination, totally fine. you can't post a Remind code in your window and start texting your patrons that there's a buy one, get one free special and they should come in and buy your pizza. So any way that is helping just coordinating and logistics and updates and things like that are fine, but it's not for commercial purposes.
Okay, that does make sense. And thank you for covering that. My other question is this platform strictly in the US or have you expanded to international use?
Yeah, so the US and Canada all have the same offerings, including our Remind plans, including texting. And then outside of the US, you are welcome to use Remind, but we don't support texts outside of US territories, and Canada. So if you're in Great Britain, you can use the app and you can get the app notifications and you can log into Remind and you can get emails if you want. We're just not going to be able to send those texts because it's just too costly for us at the moment to be supporting text internationally.
Do you think that's something that you would explore in the future, assuming that the globalization and travel and all of that is
Right.
able to return at some point?
Yeah, so we have been super interested in expanding internationally in the past. For us, because we are still a small startup, it was sort of a choice between moving into higher ed and focusing on internationalization. And we feel that the best fit with our current offering is focusing on education here in the US. So we've got a lot of work to do with relation to higher ed. So that's our first priority, but it's been an interest. Internationalization has been an interest, certainly, and will continue to be.
Okay, so on that note, now that we can't travel very
Right.
much, let's talk about how this surge in remote learning has happened in the past year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So can you talk about how COVID and this movement for remote learning has had an impact on Remind? And I'm also interested in hearing some obstacles or challenges you've run into as a result of this increased usage and reliance on your platform for communication.
Yes, so there was quite a scramble to figure out how to equip teachers to be able to teach from home when schools started closing. The volume that we were seeing in terms of requests per minute and messages sent and support tickets was completely overwhelming both our support and engineering teams. We received, just from a support perspective, we received 800% more support tickets than we were expecting. So our staff was working double time for weeks, but that doesn't get you to 800% over. So, you know, it's been humbling to see what teachers have had to do to adapt to new ways of managing their class when they can't see their kids face to face for months. And, you know, we're honored to have helped in the way that we can, which is helping create those connections. It was overwhelming, both in a good way and, you know, it was a lot of long hours, but it's just great to see the value that we can provide.
Absolutely. I can imagine. I always picture some of these companies like your company certainly, and Zoom and some of these other platforms that really had such a surge in usage when everybody began to quarantine. I just picture everyone scrambling like crazy and lots of coffee and late nights. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what I always picture.
It is. That is exactly what happened. It was a lot of conversations with our partners at home being like, how are you going to make today better than yesterday? Because we can't have more yesterdays. It was a lot.
Oof. And
Yeah.
obviously, you don't want to be happy about what's happened, but clearly it's been incredibly, for growth with Remind. This whole pandemic really forced a lot of schools to set up a system for working remotely. So, I mean, that's, I'm sure, had such a profound impact on all of your operations at Remind. So, I just want to end with one final question that I like to ask our guests. What do you see for the future? And in your case, what do you see for the future of remote learning?
Yeah. I have already seen some really amazing things come out of this situation that we've been hearing about from our teachers. So, for example, in the past, Remind, unless it's been purchased at the school or district level, has been used by teachers who are tech savvy and just took it upon themselves to find a tool to increase family engagement and stay in touch with the families that they're serving. But when it is no longer just up to teachers who are taking the initiative and now everybody has to have a tool, we've seen these amazing practices such as districts setting up technology pairings of teachers who are less inclined to adopt these tools with teachers, even in different buildings in the district, who can help them get up to speed. And what we've been hearing from our teachers and administrators is that teachers are going to administrators and saying, I want to keep my pair, I want to keep my mentor, I want to keep learning how to be leveraging all the tools that are out there to support my classroom. So I do hope that some of the things that have been put into place just as coping strategies now are actually really positive and impactful. Another example is, since learning, I mean, it's been bumpy, but in many cases has been successful. Obviously, you know, device and connectivity permitting. It's opening up schools and teachers to the possibility of supporting kids who are missing a lot of time in the classroom. It could be for an illness, it could be for a deployment. So the thinking is shifting around how schools can support kids even if that individual may not be able to make it to class. So I hope that some of the flexibility that we've seen and some of these best practices can stick around and we can continue to provide more value to students going forward.
Well, we really look forward to seeing what happens with the future of remote learning. And we're really excited to hear what comes next from Remind. So, Emily, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Meredith.
And we'll see you next time on The Brief.